Welcome to the Thinking About Computers podcast, where we talk about thinking about computers. Our guest today, Ritwik Gupta.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. Ritwik is advised by one of my advisors as well, Trevor Darrell in BAIR, and also Shanka Shastri in what lab is he in?
Computer science. He's part of BAIR.
Okay, part of BAIR as well. Ritwik is very cool in that you mainly work on computer vision methods to help aid like natural disaster discovery, prevention, things like this.
Yeah.
And you deal quite a bit with like AI and the government.
That's right. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting problems in the world of disaster response. Those environments are probably the most chaotic and complex you can imagine. Things are always shifting. Assumptions that we hold to be true change. Like, I always imagine that the Earth is 3 meters off the sea level at this point, but that may not be the case after an earthquake. So building, there's a lot of interesting AI research problems that arise. And so being inspired by that field helps me come up with really cool AI research problems that we then get to solve and transition right back to the community.
Very cool. Very cool.
It's fun stuff.
How did you, I feel like your story before coming to grad school is quite interesting, and that I feel like you had a somewhat non-traditional start where you came in knowing that this is what you wanted to do. I feel like much more compared to like the average student.
Yeah. Part of that was by accident and part of it was by design. I actually, like most Indian kids growing up, was given the option of either being a doctor or an engineer. And I decided that, like having tried out bio and chem and my dad forced me to do some computer science once in a while, decided like I might as well try and mix all of them together somehow. So in my high school time, I was very lucky and fortunate to be part of this program called the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, where they basically took up like 50 kids from around the world and like invited them to Pitt to come do research on one of 5 interesting topics. And the one that I ended up picking was bioinformatics, which is this really cool field, which basically says like, why don't we take all this cool stuff we do in bio, merge it with the power of the silicon chip, and sort of accelerate research in both domains as a result. And so I really loved it. I was like, I get to merge my love of bio, chem, and computers in like one field. I'm going to do this forever. And so I decided to sort of go ahead and major in bioinformatics. And I ended up actually going to Pitt for my undergrad. Before like very rapidly switching into computer science, because I very quickly realized that even though the field is cool, no one's going to hire you for a bioinformatics job because no one knows what it is at the time.
I also don't know what it is.
Yeah, so bioinformatics is the field that is interested in using computer science to answer biological questions. Think about things like understanding how different protein are interacting within your body, and how that might contribute to schizophrenia, for example. Like we do that normally in the wet lab. We take different proteins, we put them under the microscope, we stain them, we dye them, we do all sorts of things and we study them. That takes forever. But what if we did that using like graph theory instead? What if we did that using computational methods? I'm sure many of you have heard of things like 23andMe or Ancestry, where they do like genetic lookups to match your ancestry. Some of those basic algorithms like BLAST are a contribution of the field of bioinformatics to do these really efficient like genetic lookups. So yeah, it basically says like, let's take all these biological processes, chemical processes, and speed up that rate of discovery using computers. So yeah, it's sort of computational bio, but not really. It's like it's a more holistic field in computational bio. But yeah, similarly, like I was like, no one's going to know what this is. Like back in 2014, 2015, like, yeah, no one knew what that was. And I said I wanted to get a real job afterwards. So I just switched to computer science with the realization that I could still do bioinformatics as a computer science major because the degree, really doesn't matter. What ended up happening, though, was I was relatively bored in my undergrad. Like University of Pittsburgh is a great school. I love my time there, but we sort of lived in the shadow of Carnegie Mellon's computer science program. And even as a freshman, I'd be like, walking around on campus. Like Pitt and CMU are like this, right? Like Craig Street ends Pitt, and that starts CMU. So I'd be walking around and I'd be applying to internships and jobs, and I'd just be going on online portals and like grinding, putting in resumes. And then SpaceX would just be hanging on CMU's campus with their Dragon capsule, like just saying, we'll actually hire you on the spot if you like answer a few questions. And I was like, this is insane. Why don't we have these opportunities? So I actually like got really into organizing as a result, like organizing things that would help Pitt stand out as a computer science school in the world. And so at the time, one of the things that were really emerging on the scene were college hackathons. And so I really got involved in that area. I organize some of the first major hackathons in the country, like MHacks. I was really lucky to fall in with the Michigan crowd and like learn from them and help them organize some of these hackathons. And I brought some of that back to Pitt. Overall, though, I got really involved in like bureaucracy. And I don't know, maybe that was largely due to dissatisfaction of like status quo. But I was able to make a lot of really good connections as a result. I got really in touch with like the leadership at the University of Pittsburgh, like the chancellor's office, the leadership of the computer science department, which eventually I was able to leverage into actually being part of the hiring team to build the new School of Computing at the University of Pittsburgh. And through that, I became really close friends with the leadership at CMU. So Andrew Moore, who was the dean of Carnegie Mellon's computer science program at the time, became a close mentor. And I was talking to him one day, and he said, and I told him, like, I want to do a PhD. Like, that's, after having done some internships, I realized for my career goals, a PhD was going to be it. Like, in the world of bio, you got to have an MD if anyone wants to be taken seriously. And in the world of computer science, for the research I was doing, it was like, you have to have a PhD. So I needed one or the other. And I was like, a PhD sounds much more palatable than going to med school.
Right.
And he was like, don't do it. And for a variety of reasons. One was, he was like, I graduated a year early from college. And he was like, that's great. You have an extra year to sort of just figure your life out. Like, use that time to like actually figure out what you want to do. Two, I would not go to grad school right now and get a job instead, because you could just go out there and make money. And that's really important, because as grad students, we don't make any money. And three, like, he was like, once you start doing a job, you'll actually like know what you want to do. Like, you'll know how to be an adult, like a professional. You'll know how to manage your time, respond to emails professionally, like manage your own portfolio, etc. And you'll hopefully like just get a better sense of what you want to do. And if after all of that, you still want to come back to grad school, you can't think of a stronger selection, because most people who like go get a job first usually don't come back to grad school afterwards, because they're content with what they have. But if you still want to come back, then that's probably a pretty good indicator for success. Yeah. So it's like, all right, that makes sense. I was actually lucky enough to, at the time, have an offer from Apple to work on the Apple Health team doing like, detection of atrial fibrillation on the Apple Watch. And I was going to sign that offer on like a Saturday. That same week, I actually got a pretty cool offer from this place called the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute to instead do research over at CMU SEI. And the whole idea was that like I would be doing research that's like DoD adjacent, but I sort of got to pick what I wanted to work on. And in those conversations, I was talking to, who would eventually become my boss at the time, Matt Gaston. I was talking to Andrew, and the whole question was like, will I be able to get my PhD here? And they said, we'll figure it out. Like, we'll make it happen. Just come and work here. And so I did. And for the next 5 years, I essentially worked at CMU, and my H that I was working on went from health to humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And I've had a lot of fun doing it. Like, it's been really impactful. Some of the research that I've done is being used daily by like dozens of disaster response organizations around the world. We've actually changed the game as to how many different organizations view data, actually view disaster management as a whole. And obviously, we've been able to publish a few set of what I would call good machine learning papers as well out of it. Though hopefully, there's more down the line as well.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So when did you start getting involved in more like policy, or like, I guess, were you in cahoots with the government? Not to make that sound negative, but
yeah, that's a good question. It was very accidental. So SEI, right, is a Department of Defense federally funded research and development center. It's called an FFRDC. And there's many around the US. You've heard of the national labs like Berkeley Lab, Lawrence Livermore. Those are FFRDCs, JPL at NASA. And the DoD has a few, like SEI, MIT Lincoln Lab, RAND. Like, these are all DoD FFRDC. So all of our money comes from the DoD. And so at the time, one of the very first things I got to work on was on autonomous vehicles that worked off road for autonomous evacuations of soldiers. Like someone gets injured and it's very hot firefight going on. You can't send in more people safely to recover them. So why don't we send in a robot that can actually, someone will load them onto the, train on the platform at the time, but then it'll autonomously make its way out. That not only made me interested in humanitarian stuff, but also got me more into the sort of government sector, right? Of like, we built this cool stuff, but like, who's going to use it now? Mm-hmm. Pretty soon after, I was in charge of this project called XView2, which was how do we do damage assessment from satellite imagery? We're some of the first people in the world to think about this problem, and we're some of the first people in the world to actually be successful at solving that problem. And once we actually rolled out these models, we started talking to people. Like the Australian bushfires were going on at the time in New South Wales, and we were giving it these models over to these government agencies, and everyone was like, this is amazing. Can you just like take this and run it for us and give us the outputs? Because they had no way of running those models. They had no one who was educated on how to open up a terminal and run Python, for example. And they certainly had no way to actually acquire the data themselves. Like the satellite imagery, they had no pipeline for it. And that frustrated me. I was like, wait a second, we built this amazing tool. You guys should be using it for societal gain, but you have no way to do so. And me as one person can't be like fielding all these requests all the time. So the policy questions rose like sort of accidentally that way, right? Like what policy is preventing you from acquiring satellite imagery? What policies can we put into place to train personnel at your organization, which will know how to use machine learning models? And we started writing and like drafting these policies with the government agencies. Some of them started being like adopted. And I eventually realized that I was spending most of my time answering policy questions and actually less of my time doing the technological work. But it was all very interrelated, right? Like usually the way the policy works is that like some cool thing will happen. Like we'll make a cool widget. The engineers will make something. The policy people will then sort of scramble to get smart about it and write policies about it. But in my case, it was pretty interesting because I was the one making the technology and then also being the one to write the policies to adopt it properly. So that co-design of technology and policy has sort of been my go-to ever since. I think it's actually a much more powerful and flexible way to do things because who better to understand technology than you? And if you know how the government works and you know how policy is written and how it's passed and how it's made, then you can be much more effective at making sure that technology is rolled out broadly for the right reasons. And so I've been doing that ever since. Like, let's build some cool stuff and let's make sure it's adopted appropriately and responsibly throughout whatever it is. It could be an organization like Apple, or it could be an agency like like the DoD, for example.
And how'd you end up at Berkeley from CMU? So you were there for 5 years after undergrad and then came over here?
Yeah. So with XView2, I was collaborating very closely with an agency known as the Defense Innovation Unit, which is based out of Mountain View. And also with NASA Ames and with the California National Guard based out of Sacramento. And so I decided to just move out west. CMU has a campus here in Mountain View on Moffett Field called CMU Silicon Valley. And I was like, well, since that makes no sense for me to fly out to San Francisco every other week, which is what I was doing, may as well just move there and like just work there for a bit and then come back. So I did. And I remember being in my office at CMU Silicon Valley, and I get a call one day from the admissions office saying like, you were technically taking like PhD courses, but you can't do that anymore because you don't meet the residency requirement. And I was like, wait a second. I'm like sitting in the CMU office here on the other side of the world, but like, it doesn't, surely it's like the same thing. So they said you can't do your PhD here, at least in the way that I wanted to, right? Or I would have to go back immediately, and that would screw up a lot of my collaborations. I was fortunate enough at the time to be involved in some pretty cool initiatives. At the time, the administration was trying to launch a national AI for Good initiative. And so I was able to help the administration at the time launch the National AI for Disaster Response Initiative. And I would say I played a small part, but I was able to be in the room at the White House and like help launch some of these things. And over there, I was introduced to, or I was told to then go meet with Trevor Darrell, who had some interest in disaster response at the time. And so I got to speak at his lab. And as we were chatting, he was like, hey, why don't you just come do your PhD and finish it over here? And I was like, well, that'd be great. Like, that sounds awesome. Let's figure out how to do it. And before I knew it, he linked me up with Shankar, who was running the Blum Center at the time, which is our Center for Developing Economies. And both of them decided to support my admission to Berkeley, and I ended up here.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, very lucky. I don't know if I would have gotten in otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Really, I feel like just on paper, you're an incredibly strong candidate. And I don't just say that to flatter you, but I think of like my mother, for instance. My mom just finished her PhD in kinesiology. And when I think about like, not in a mean way, but like, how did she get admitted? She's been out of school for forever. But if you're like a professor trying to figure out which candidate to choose, and you have a ton of people with good grades who have maybe some research experience, and their like, what do you call it? Statement of purpose is like, yeah, I'm interested in the whole field of machine learning, versus a candidate that's like had work experience and has a very clear idea of what they want to do, has experience in what they want to do. Just from like a risk assessment perspective, I would be like, oh, I definitely want this second person. They are working on impactful problems. It's more of a quote unquote like safe option. And obviously you're amazing, but.
Well, I appreciate that. I think for me, and I don't know how it is for other people, but I think I live a lot of my life, especially after I got into Berkeley, like with heavy imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I feel like I work with some really, really smart, amazing people. Like I work with you and I'm like, I wish I could be 5% as productive as you are when it comes to running experiments, getting stuff done. You are amazing in that way, right? Like I wish I had that capacity. And so like I look at the people around me, I'm like, I'm not an amazing theoretician. Like I don't, if you ask me about like how the atom optimizer works, I would stare at you blankly. I'd be like, you tell me, I'm not the guy for that. If you ask me how a transformer works like deeply, I could not tell you that either, even though theoretically I do research on them.
Yeah.
I'm good at a very like, I feel like a niche set of things that are maybe more holistic or more human oriented, and technology is sort of part of that tool set. So when I look at the people around me and I'm like, oh my God, these people came in with like 3 publications, or like they're pumping out 4 papers a year. Like, what am I doing? I feel totally inadequate. And like, you know, I was on the admissions committee this year, and we were looking at over
that's
800
a big
candidates.
Ego hit when you work admissions.
But looking at that, I was like, holy crap, there were like people in this pile that were like, they had like an H index of 35 coming in.
Yeah.
Like, and like, I presume that like the pile was probably as competitive as when I applied. The fact that I got in is like, for me, was like the biggest like spot of luck. I don't think every day I come into Berkeley, I'm like, I don't belong in this room. But I feel like in some ways that's probably a good thing and motivates me to be better. Yeah. There's always that saying about never being the dullest pencil, or something like that, right? Yeah. Never being the sharpest pencil. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I do not know how I ended up here. I'm very lucky to be here. I actually think it's a much more engaging and collaborative environment than Carnegie Mellon was in many ways.
Oh, nice.
I have that feeling a bit as well. So like, because I was in industry for a while, and I was like, and I applied to grad school twice, and the first time I got rejected from every school I applied to, and then I applied again, and I was like pretty surprised and obviously pleased to get into Berkeley. But yeah, the imposter syndrome was tough. I feel like I've gotten over the hump on it a bit, but it's
I feel kind of the opposite. I feel probably because I was already at Berkeley, I feel like coming in, I had much less imposter syndrome than the average person, because I was like, listen, no one here knows what they're doing. Like, come on. But like, especially recently, it's funny because when I look at you, you have something that I really admire, which is you can describe things so well and like on the spot. Like someone will ask you a question, you have such an eloquent response that's easy to understand, whereas I tend to just go on a ton of tangents. And yeah, it's been interesting seeing like when you work with different people, imposter syndrome just shows up in different ways. Like sometimes I'll work with people and I'm like, wow, I am like not this technical, or I'm not this theoretical or something. And yeah, working admissions is definitely like, how the heck did I get in?
Yeah, it's It's funny you say that because I promise you 90% of the time I'm just faking it. Like, I don't know what I'm saying.
True, fake it till you make it. Yeah. I will say on the admission side, something that I was kind of pleased with when I was working it is there are people which we would call like paper bills of like you're an undergrad, you have 10 publications, but it's only been 2 years. And then you look at these publications and they're all kind of roughly the same idea, but with like different dressing on it. And uh, when I worked admissions, these people were seen as not as desirable as people with 1 to 2 really good papers, which kind of, I guess, made me happy in that it takes a lot of stress off of future undergrads of I don't need 45 papers to get into a PhD program. And in fact, like quality matters much more than quantity if the quantity is greater than or equal to 1. But yeah.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways, like incentives are so misaligned in our field, like in academia. It's sort of hard to know what to aim for, even. But I'm very thankful that I get to be around you guys. Even when I first met you, and we got to meet at the sort of the first day, the BAIR orientation, and you were telling me that you were in industry. I was like, I have someone who can relate to me. Someone else who's been through the same journey. So it's nice to see that there was still a diversity of thought in the cohort and like people with different backgrounds. So it's pretty cool.
So how would you say your PhD experience do you think has differed from people who maybe didn't take a break or like didn't have such a large space in between undergrad and grad school?
I think it's different in a few ways. Maybe I could talk about like the professional aspect of it and then maybe the social aspect of it as well.
Sure.
Like professionally, coming in with like a very specific idea what I wanted to do was in some ways a boon because I didn't have to spend that like first year just searching for projects or like doing whatever Trevor wanted me to do because I knew what I wanted to do. I had an idea, I was going to execute on it, and Trevor was there to support me as a PI, and it was going to be great. Simultaneously, it was very isolating because like I'm the only one working on the things that I care about, and trying to convince people to also work on like disasters or climate or satellites was like seen as this like I feel like is like still seen as like a little outsider thing. Like, what are you doing or talking about? Like, it's not relevant. And so it became like this like cool thing because I got to like do what I wanted to do. But then I was also like, it was very much like you're on your own. Like you have to do it alone.
Yeah.
So my expectation was that I'd be highly productive going in because I know exactly what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But realistically, as I think all of us realize in this room, like no machine learning research today is done by a single person. It's usually in a larger collaboration. And I wasn't able to find the collaborators that I wanted to find because they just weren't there. They weren't interested. And so I think that was a bit of a shell shock for me, like adjusting to that and like figuring out then how to scale my collaborations and like, or find different collaborators outside of Berkeley or outside of BAIR to sort of fill that gap was an interesting transition point that I feel like someone coming in here from undergrad wouldn't have had. Mm-hmm. Also, like I was, and to this day, like I was so like not prepared for things like I have to do homework again. Like, yes. Dude, like I hadn't touched like a problem set in 5 years. What do you mean I have to like sit here and start like cranking out theorems? Like I think I failed my first 2 homeworks that I did here at Berkeley. Or at least spent way longer than any other person did because like I literally had to revise like things like how do expectations commute or things like that. Like don't remember that anymore. And I would still say that theoretically, compared to everyone else at BAIR, I am probably theoretically the weakest person here in terms of like math theory. Like I dropped out of statistical learning theory because I was like, I'm not revising these concepts again. It's not relevant. Like it's cool, but it's not. I'm not going to use this ever again in my life.
I also like saw the first problem set for that class my first semester of grad school and was like, yeah, I don't remember any of this stuff. Like it's been over 10 years since I've taken linear algebra. Like I'm not going to relearn it today, and dropped it.
Yeah. So that was definitely a big thing. Like I feel like in undergrad, you're like already in that mindset. You're ready to go.
Yeah.
Socially, it was a bit different too because like I came in with like bills and responsibilities and like a life, right? Like I had a partner, like I wanted to get home on time so I could spend time with her. And like I was living in San Francisco and not in Berkeley, right? Because that's where I was already. So I wasn't gonna like just up and move immediately because my partner also had her job there. So like socially it was a bit isolating because everyone else is in that undergrad mode of like, we're all 22 years old, let's go hang out together and go to bars. And I'm like, I'm 25. Like I just want to go to bed.
Yeah.
And you know, like so socially it was a bit awkward. I still think that like I maybe missed out on that aspect of it. Like I wasn't able to make as many friends as I would have wanted to. But I think it overall worked out fine. Like I still think there's people of all walks of life, so it like all things equal, it came out fine. But yeah, that was certainly a different, wholly different set of adjustments I had to make, that I feel like maybe just people straight out of undergrads don't necessarily have.
Yeah.
Also, my partner was like used to me working very different hours, and that switched overnight. I was like,
really?
I had like a 9 to 5, you know, like more or less a decent, like well structured job.
Yeah.
And that went to like, I'm working 24/7.
Yeah.
You better get used to it.
That's something I noticed a lot coming to grad school as well. Is like I was used to a 9 to 5, and my wife was used to me working a 9 to 5, and that I'd say a lot of people that isn't there. A lot of grad students don't work 9 to 5, but I like have kept that system, and yeah, it's definitely a source of friction sometimes, like with collaborations and like people like, oh, like let's meet Saturday morning or like let's meet at 9 at night, and but for the most part, it's been okay outside of like deadline weeks. I feel like for me.
Yeah, deadline weeks get tough. My
Yeah.
girlfriend is not happy with me during deadline weeks.
No,
She's like, you better make it up afterwards.
Yep.
I think one thing that was also different coming in for me was I still have a full-time job outside of Berkeley, like or basically a full-time job. Like I work at the Defense Innovation Unit as the deputy technical director for autonomy, whatever that means, right? Like, but I like have a full-time job, and balancing that is, I don't think, a challenge that other people would otherwise have. Like I don't think an undergrad coming straight into grad school would have those responsibilities as well. And like, yes, that's like totally self-inflicted. But I think it came with the territory of like also doing policy work, being like engaged with the government, like giving that roll up was near impossible for me at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting because last podcast, we had Shashir on, and Shashir, when giving advice, basically said, I have never met a person who was able to work a full-time job and do a PhD. So as someone who is doing it quite successfully, why do you think it works for you when it wouldn't maybe work for a lot of people?
Well, I do think that because of it, I'm able to do both jobs like less well than I would if I were doing any one of them just at the same time. Like I don't think I'm able to be the best technical director at DIU. Neither am I able to be the best student at Berkeley because like I have other things I need to do sometimes. Like rather experiments tonight, I'm going to be out there reviewing companies like submissions. Like it's the total. It shouldn't just a waste of time, but like from a Berkeley PhD perspective, it's a total waste of time. And so I would actually say that I don't know if it actually does work that well for me. Maybe externally it looks like that. But the other thing that I think is in my favor is that the full-time job I do have is very supportive of me getting my PhD. And in many cases, the things I'm doing for my PhD overlap very cleanly with the work that I'm doing at the DIU. Or if it doesn't initially, some way, like I'm able to make it align very well. So if it wasn't for that like flexibility, I think it'd be impossible. Like if I was literally just like something totally like, supplementary to like what I do today. As it is still though, like I think I end up working like 70-hour weeks, which doesn't leave room for a lot. That's like on paper, right? And then like there's all the other hours you put in as a grad student.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't keep the full-time job at the same time, but just the circumstances made it so that it made a lot of sense for me to do this because I think there's a lot of mutual benefit in me having that job.
Has it ever caused, and feel free to not answer this if it's a controversial answer, but has it ever caused any friction with like your advisors or collaborators if you're really like juggling? I have this full-time job. I assume that there are sometimes weeks where you don't really have anything, like on the research side.
Yeah, it has. It's caused friction on both sides. And I'm lucky enough that the people I work with on both sides are amazing people and get it and get the constraints. Like some of them have gotten their PhDs previously, like on my full-time job. So like they know what it's like and they're willing to give me some grace. There's times where I completely drop the ball and like I'm just, I feel like more often than not I'm apologizing rather than actually succeeding at something. I think it just comes down to like very careful juggling of things and always trying to then figure out who I'm going to let down at what time. Like it's going to happen and then I have to just time it appropriately.
Right.
It's like mentally very taxing. Like I hold myself to a very high standard and like knowing I'm going to let someone down is like terrible for me. And like in therapy, that's what I talk about. So at some point, either the PhD is going to end or the full-time job is going to end. Like one thing's got to go because it's not sustainable long term. But it's working in the meantime.
Yeah. It's funny. These are also a lot of my conversations with my therapist are like, I'm failing and I need to tell people that I'm failing. Like this is going to suck. And I had a conversation pretty similar to that sentiment with Trevor. And Trevor was like, listen, Lisa, you just need to decide every day, what am I going to fail at? And then just fail at those things, realize you're going to fail at those things, and like move on.
Interesting.
And I'm like, I understand the sentiment, but also, oh my God, really? Like this sounds terrible. But I think it is right in some ways of failing is probably not the right way to put it, but you want to put your all into everything and you really want to create like a good product for everything that you do, but you have limited time. And when you've committed to something, sometimes it's better to come up with an okay product instead of just completely dropping it. Yeah.
Yeah. I do like very aggressive like prioritization of my various like ongoing tasks, which it works pretty well. Like I like, put classes at the very bottom of the prioritization and like, oh, like didn't do the homework. That's great. It wasn't a high priority.
Yeah.
But yeah, it can be hard to pick what should bump what. And yeah, disappoints people.
Yeah.
Something I feel like we talk about a lot on the podcast is like the different forms of impact and like how, quantitatively like papers and citations, like the traditional way that people measure academics. But, these days there's a lot more like, open source projects and like putting your ideas out there and like communicating with people and other sorts of things. And it seems like you probably have a very different perspective on the impact of academic research than a lot of people, since you're like deploying these ideas to solve real problems.
I don't think I have a perspective that's so unique. I mean, maybe it's unique in academia, but I think it's, as someone who was in industry, I feel like you might have a similar perspective, which is like you mentioned, like citations are not the only measure of impact. Like one of the things I'm most proud of is this paper and method we created to detect illegal fishing vessels from synthetic aperture radar satellite imagery. And like the paper has like 13 citations, maybe. This NURBS paper, we're very proud of it. But we've deployed the work in the real world and we've actually arrested illegal fishermen and human traffickers because of it. And like that impact is not quantifiable. I mean, yeah, you can say like, oh yeah, 3 human traffickers or whatever, right? Not a real number, just made up.
That would have been great to add in your experiment section.
Yeah, I know. Like later on, like, and this is what we did.
Right.
And then here's the ethics statement.
Exactly. Ethics statement, 4 pages long.
That's right. But I feel like industry has it the same way, right? Like not every paper that industry releases is like this massively successful paper, but the impact, the economic impact or the product impact that paper made might have been huge at the time. So I think it's probably the same thing.
How do you think about your own impact? Like, are you concerned with the number of citations, like getting a lot of papers out, or are you kind of pleased with your impact outside of that world of things and the papers are just, just follow from that? Or How do you think about it?
Well, I'd be lying if I said I don't care about my citation count. I do. I think that's become a thing, like, especially since I got to Berkeley and like being like, holy crap, everyone's publishing and that paper got 30 citations, but mine only got 10. Like, this is injustice. Fix it now.
I feel that.
But I do think that I am much less worried about getting out a paper at any given point than many of my peers. Like, I don't really care if I published at all this year because I know that whatever I will publish will have a very direct impact because I've already set up those transition pathways ahead of time. And I know that's going to be a successful paper. And I'm lucky enough that Trevor and Shankar and my collaborators don't expect me to be publishing on like any sort of cadence or frequency. I think they realize the sort of niche that I fill in the world. But yeah, I do care about. I will go on Google Scholar and look at my H index once in a while and be like, I wish that was higher. Especially because like I'm looking at what I'm going to do after I graduate, and one of the options is go become faculty or go join industry or startup or government or whatever. All the options, and seemingly all that matters for faculty positions is your paper output and your what was your impact and how many New York Times articles did you have and things like that. And I really struggle with communicating the relevance of the impact I have had to my peers, let alone to like a future hiring committee. So if you guys can help me figure that out, that'd be great because I will go on the faculty market at some point.
Yeah. Well, hopefully all of us will. So maybe we should figure it out by then. Yeah. But sort of along a similar vein, I'm wondering in your day-to-day life, how much time are you spending doing like more of the low level, I need to code this experiment versus it seems like on the policy end, a lot of it is just education, translation, like more the human element of it, which I'd say these two things are like pretty separate from one another.
Yes and no.
Okay.
So when I was CMU, I was in a position where I eventually became more of like a manager and a PI rather than like a hands-on programmer. And like transitioning out of that into Berkeley and like trying to write code was and is a hard transition. Like, and even in my day job, right? Like my job isn't writing code. It's to be more of like a executive in a way, right? Like I'm making decisions. I'm saying like we should pick this company and not this one for reasons X, Y, and Z. And if I need someone to write something or do some code, I'm like, all right, you should go do this, and
right.
We'll decide the results. One of the skills you have to inculcate, and that I've been trying to work on recently again, is like being that individual contributor, right? Like you want that first author publication, which means you need to be the ones who have the experiments, the method, et cetera, and get that out there. So I've been trying to get back to that and doing a lot more of like my own experiments. And I would say that for the last year and a half, I've been successful at that. But it was probably the hardest transition, the hardest like real world job to academia transition was like shifting that mindset. Policy is definitely like a lot more the human component. And I think that it is reducible to like communication and education at the end of the day, but it is actually a lot more technical than I think most people think it is, right? Like it's not just like, let me communicate to you how a transformer works. It's also like then doing the deep analysis of like, here is the economic impact of a transformer in this industry. And here's what happens if a transformer with this many parameters gets out in the wild and does all these things. And here's what you should do about it. And here's all the numbers of like why this like treatment will like be better than the other like non-policy treatment. So like there is a lot more analysis involved. It may not be as quantitative necessarily as what we do in computer science, where we build these tables and baselines and metrics and like, there's a bold number at the end of the day to cite. But it is, I would say, more technical than maybe you would think at first pass.
Interesting.
Though I will say though, like any competent computer scientist who knows how to communicate could maybe much more easily do policy than the other way around. Like those technical skills are hard to beat. And I'm actually recruiting, like if any of you want to become more policy minded, I think there's a big need for people who are thinking about this what I'm trying to term like technology policy co-design.
Yeah.
It's usually been either technologists and policymakers, but it's never been both.
Yeah. It does seem like a hard thing to balance, because I feel like I come from sort of the opposite of where you come from, where I am very used to being like boots on the ground, coding everything. And I have found it quite hard, and I would say have mostly failed at trying to transition to more of a like managerial role. Just because it, for me, it is often hard to reason between I'm going to spend this time telling someone to do something versus like I'm just going to do it. And oftentimes that like I have to accept that it might take more time to explain it than to do it, but that is worth it. And then the main thing is just losing that control, which I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts on this are. Of, you know, you're putting quite a lot of trust in someone to do it, but also make sure that they're presenting the information in a way that isn't incredibly biased or potentially flawed.
I think that's a great question. It's one that I don't think I fully answered myself either, but it's certainly, I think, one I have some experience with. So I was lucky enough to have some very good managers in my career. My close friend and mentor, Matt Gaston, Dave Graham, Heather Evans, they were all around when I was very much like you, right? I would just like, all right, we want to make a model. I'll write the model. We'll get it running. It's easy. Like I was for the large part, like for the first 2.5 years of my career, just like programmer. Like I was out there writing code. And then eventually I think they recognized that I was also good at communication and doing all these things. And I started feeling this like more like managerial role, right? It's like I started writing grant proposals and doing all these different things. To eventually where it became like 90% of my day, and maybe only 10% of my day was spent like writing code, if that even. Maybe that 10% of the day was spent like doing Excel. And I had huge trust issues with like letting go of that. I believe in my ability to be a programmer, and I believe in my ability to do that well. And like my way to do it is the only right way. Like that was like my mindset at the time. And Dave and Heather like sat me down one day and were like, some of the people you've helped hire, some of the people we've hired, and like you have to trust in their abilities, right? Like they're very educated people, they're very talented people. Lean on them. And realistically, like how much can you scale? Like you only have so many hours in the day before you'll fall and collapse. And it's not scalable, right? It's not scalable for you everything alone. Whereas if you were to like take your abilities to like communicate and like sort of massage communication and use those part of your skills so that 3 other people can just go ahead and like run and write the code, then you're expanding your impact by like 3x, right? Because you're taking that burden off of them. And that sort of reframing like helped me understand like my role a little bit better. Like, yes, like I could be a great like programmer and push the flag forward myself, or I could help like a squad of people sort of push the flag forward altogether. And I'm sort of the one who's like making sure that they're unencumbered. But I had huge trust issues in doing that. Like I still like let them do the work, but then verified explicitly or like ask them to do it my way. And like I think there's a lot of books on like management style that came into play of like how do you actually like do this delegation. But it was entirely a learned thing, and I still haven't learned how to do that well enough yet. And for a year I actually overcorrected and went too much in the other direction. So yeah, I think it's one of those things you just sort of constantly learn over time. But letting go and just trusting someone and like who they are and how they do it is very freeing in many ways. Like you also get exposed to working methodologies that you weren't familiar with before, that you didn't know worked well before, and it sort of makes you a better person because you're like, I didn't even know you could do it that way, and it worked well. So it's pretty nice.
Yeah, I should really start mentoring undergrads again.
You're such a good mentor too. I've never met an undergrad who didn't speak highly working with you. You should do it.
Wow, it's good because I paid them to do it. No, yeah, I don't know. It's been some successes and some not successes. Not at no fault to the undergrad, at only the fault of myself. But Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I've also been there. I've also had more recently like more failed undergrad collaborations than I would have wanted.
Yeah.
And that's due to my fault of like not being able to do that same calibration of how much do I delegate versus how much do I do myself. Like that is, I think, an ever ongoing battle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes on the podcast, we like to ask people to rank the different years of their PhD, like on a scale of 1 to 10. So you're in year 3 right now,
I'm
right?
in my third year, yeah.
How have these first 3 years been?
Well, they've all been great. I've
10,
got
10, 10, yeah.
10, 10, 10. I had to rank them.
Or if you had to give a theme for each year, keywords.
Oh man. Oh, I think that's a better question actually. And then I'll do the ranking as well. But the first year was definitely like rebuilding, like just learning new habits, like learning to break my old way of working, just learning to be in a new environment. Like how does like being in a very high performing, high fast paced AI lab actually look and feel like? Year two was like really like building a lot of collaborations. We built the BAIR climate initiative, which has been super successful. I got to build really cool collaborations with like Colorado and Matheny and others, and like we got a lot of really cool research out. And year three so far has been a lot of like sort of reforming, honestly. Like it's been, now that I've been able to build these skills of like I know how to sort of behave in this environment, I know how to execute in this environment. How do I sort of now make it fully my own, like my full own experience, and like give it my own flavor of like, if I want to focus on policy stuff for like 6 months, I'm going to do that and I'm going to be happy with it. And I'll be happy with myself that I'm doing that rather than like always being bored by imposter syndrome. So I'd probably rank it like year two, year three, year one, like 1, 2, 3. But none of it would be possible without that first year of like just learning to sort of really relearn everything, forcing with emotions. Year three is also great because I have no classes. And so that's always a nice thing to have.
Yeah.
No more homework. I never have to worry about feeling stupid over a math problem ever again.
Yeah. I'm currently teaching, bringing a whole new realm of feeling stupid. But that's okay.
I'll actually put out a plug. I'm teaching a course next semester called War: Emerging Technologies and National Security, taught by a cool professor and one of my advisors, Andrew Reddy. And I'll be his hopefully fearless TA. But it focuses on like, so there's a very famous course at Berkeley, like pretty world renowned, called War exclamation point, which is like it examines war, international relations, public policy, etc. This course is war question mark. And it's more so like, why does war happen? How does war cause the creation of more technology, or does technology cause war? And if so, like let's analyze that and like see what happens. I think that like technologists by default would be very interested in it because it's like it's a very seminar heavy course and we discuss a lot of things like the like impact and why and how and all those things, and get to learn a lot about theories that you won't be familiar with. Like I never knew about who Clausewitz was till I took this course last year. Like very famous like political scientist and Prussian general. So yeah, you get a whole new tool set of things to use, and actually a lot of the papers that I wrote in that course actually turned into publications. So if anyone's interested, it's a grad and undergrad level seminar, and I find it to be awesome, and hopefully you'll find it too. I'll be teaching some of it, so hopefully you'll find it even better. But yeah, low plug, public policy 190, 290.
All right, I need to take my outside minor course still, so
Perfect.
Take the course. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Nice. Kind of riffing off of that, but also completely unrelated. What's your opinion on ethics statements in papers?
Oh man. I think ethics statements were a good idea at a good time, right? I think people, there's been this like wave obviously of like AI ethics that's gone around, and for the right reasons. Obviously our friend and colleague Deb and others have like really like been at the spear tip of like a lot of this movement, and they identified the right problem, right? And like they and their cohort of people were like, yeah, we're doing all this work, and as engineers and scientists, we have a duty to society of like identifying what the problems are with it are going to be. People were publishing papers on like face recognition and like misclassifying whole classes of people, and like that was just a accepted CVPR paper, and we'd say nothing about it. Like there's no reflection on the scientists whatsoever, just because they got a bold number, and that's all that mattered.
Right.
So the ethics statements were for the right reason at the right time. What's happened though afterwards is like an entire sort of reduction of that paragraph. Like a lot of us are working on like fundamental theory. Like we're working on like how do we do more efficient detection? And of course, there's going to be infinite downstream impacts. Like yes, more efficient detection will not only help us like identify cancer better, but it might help China also identify Uyghur Muslims much faster. Is it your responsibility as like a theorist to write about this? Probably not. Like you're so far left of the downstream impact that like it's fundamental research. Like you really don't have to say much more beyond that, right? Like we're doing it because it's fundamental research. So that ethics statements are like sort of degrading as a result of that. And now what's happened, we're at this point where like it is essentially a joke. For example, and I know I've talked about this before, like Lion 5B was a data set that we put out that we're very proud of. Everyone uses, hopefully no longer, but like everyone was using, and was basically collected by scraping the entire internet's worth of images, or at least a lot of it, right? Creative Commons, whatever, not creative, Common Crawl, etc. And the authors in the paper were like, yeah, there's porn in this data set. We're gonna classify the porn and we're going to keep it in there. We're just gonna label it as porn. And what they didn't realize was that pornographic material might also be child sexual abuse material. And in fact, it was later found by a friend at Stanford that there was CSAM in this data set. The ethics, if you go to Open Review and look at the ethics review from NeurIPS dataset and benchmark tracks for that paper, which is, by the way, the DNB track at NeurIPS actually places a much more emphasis on the ethics review than like your normal track does, like because these are critical data sets and there's big ethical issues. The ethics reviewer was like, this is a really ethically dubious data set for copyright issues and for X, Y, and Z issues. Like they did a good job of like really like writing a good review of why this might not be ethically good and a reason for not accepting the paper. And then at the end, they essentially said, I'm paraphrasing, but if we don't accept it, someone else will. And it's already being used, right?
Yeah.
Everyone knows who it is. Like your double blind is a joke today.
Right.
And also DNB is single blind by default. So the recommendation was strong accept. Like after that, I really don't think that ethics statements matter anymore. Like it's a good thing in the sense of like every scientist should think about the responsibilities, but maybe there's a better way to go about this than by having an explicit ethics statement in your papers. ICML this year literally said, if you're like, here's the boilerplate, you should copy and paste if you're doing like method statement. Why even bother having this like statement anymore? Like or this paragraph anymore? I think what we really need instead is like a fundamental change in how we educate scientists, like AI researchers in undergrad and grad school. Why aren't we required to take as part of our like course requirements as PhD students like an ethics course? It would be way more useful to me than like taking like some arbitrary course in the art school just because it's an outside minor. Engineers and other fields do it, because their technologies have lifelong impacts. I would argue ours do too. There's better ways to address this than ethics statements.
Yeah, I do think that there's a pretty big hole in like ethical best practices in research, both from a perspective of like what is and isn't okay to put in a research paper. For example, I personally think that it is not okay to put people's face, like pictures with people's faces, if they are not a celebrity. Like it is just something that I personally think is it makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel like even if it's part of this public data set, there's a high chance the person in it doesn't actually know that they're in this data set, and they may not be consenting to this. And then there's also the other side of knowing enough ethics to know whether your project, you want to pursue a project. Like I think right now you would be hard pressed to find someone who gets really far in a project, realizes that it could have like very real negative impact, and is okay with just saying, all right, let's drop it. Let's not publish it. Like it's just so hard to make that trade-off.
I think the incentives in our field fundamentally throw some ethics out the window. So I'm not calling Bill and Tim out because I think they're fantastic people and they're great researchers. I'm calling out the culture that I think led to this, right? So Bill and Tim released Sora at OpenAI. It's an amazing model that does the great time series generations of 3D scenes that are very physically consistent. They released amazing videos on Twitter about it, that like, we built this thing and it's OpenAI, so you assume that they're going to probably productize it at some point. They're doing this right before an election cycle. Like, how crazy and terrible is that? Like that, what's the worry about this technology being used to create like fake news about like, some candidate doing something they didn't do? What I found, and putting all that aside, what I found the most concerning was when they came to speak at Berkeley. And not a single student, like none of the questions in the crowd that entire day were about why did you do this, or like what are the implications of this work. Everyone was asking really cool technical questions. No one, not a single person asked, what do you think is the implication of you doing this work? And I think that's a cultural issue. Like, to me, that was the first question that came to mind of like, well, why would you do it? And I think that opens up like second order questions of like I don't want, like, you don't want to stop progress in the field, but you also don't want to do things that are crazy unethical. It's such a subjective thing that I don't feel comfortable taking like a fixed stance on it, but also like I feel like we just don't do enough justice to it by not having more conversations about it.
Yeah, I do feel like I was also at this Sora talk, and I do feel like if someone asked like, what are the like ethical implications of this? Did you actually ask this question or no?
I did not know.
Yeah, I feel like if someone did ask this question, there would be a fair amount of people in the room that are like, come on, like, just because it seems so out of character or something for the culture. It's like, oh, you're killing my vibe. Like, these are such cool videos. Why are you talking about like ethical implications? Like, why did we do it? Because we could. But those conversations should probably change.
I actually think like, and what I've started to realize is like, same with climate work, right? Is like, maybe we should just rephrase it differently. It's not actually like, we shouldn't phrase a question in why did you do this? Like, you maybe shouldn't have done this because it's terrible. Maybe we should phrase it as like, it's a really interesting technical challenge of how you would build this method that still preserve properties X, Y, and Z. Right? Like, and if you phrase it that way, I think those very smart scientists and engineers would actually rise up to the challenge and solve those problems while still making net progress. And so part of it is discourse related and how we ask these questions, etc. And part of it is very much, I do think there's a fundamental cultural issue of like, I think as academics, we're very happy to just do things just because. So maybe meeting in the middle somewhere would be a happy medium, but I also don't know how we have that conversation as a larger AI research enterprise globally. There's a lot of fear mongering that happens in the government right now of like, if we don't do it, China's going to do it. Right. And it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't do it either. Like, maybe we can just go talk to them and be like, we can all agree that this is the net negative for society and we should just all not do it. And I know that's idealistic, but there are ways in which we can have these conversations. Or maybe we can go talk to our amazing colleagues at Tsinghua University and be like, so, we won't do stuff about like bias face recognition in CVPR and you won't either. Like, cool.
Little Cold War vibes.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I actually don't know what the good mechanism is to like establish new norms in the field. And I think this is a space where like our leaders, like our professors and institutions, like can like really set the tone. And I think actually OpenAI is like, Sora isn't released because they did realize these concerns. But I think they could be more vocal and public about it and sort of set new norms.
And speaking of should we do this, you've mentioned that there is some discussions happening in the government on open source LLMs and whether or not they should exist. And you have a pretty strong stance on this, I feel.
Yeah, and my stance probably come off stronger than they are, just because I feel like I really overemphasize some points.
Well, they also like people publish like a Berkeley, this is Berkeley's opinion, but Berkeley, I think many people disagree with Berkeley's take.
I also think like a Silicon Valley culture has entered AI now, like, tech bro, crypto bro culture of like, I'm going to make a very controversial claim and it's going to be the truth. And like, that's AI discourse now. There is a lot of talk in the government at large about open AI models being harmful. And where this came from was a lot of like concerns that were raised by members of the community about, are AI models dangerous? Like, can they be weaponized? And we were seeing many trends, and we are seeing many trends where they can be made into weapons, right? Like, yes, I can build a better missile, better by some definition, using AI. And what started happening was some hyperbole started being made. Like, and I apologize to anyone who believes this, but like, people were like, AI is just as bad as nuclear weapons, right? Like, really alarming claims started being made without really any of the same things that make nuclear weapons bad as they are, right? And so these conversations started of like, holy crap, like what happens if my AI model, this nuclear weapon, is given for free in the open to my adversary? I don't want them to have a nuke, right? Or something equivalent to it. And simultaneously, we had these really cool companies that proposed to be open AI research labs that were anything but, right? Like a lot of them became closed research labs, and they started hiring very big policy teams, which were policy teams in name, aka lobbyists, and started lobbying Congress and the executive branch to say like, these open model development is bad because they don't know how to control it properly, but we do because we're the world's smartest scientists and we pay them very well to do this work. You should just trust us to do this model development instead and call us scaling labs, and we'll deal with frontier models for you. They invented frontier models as a term just because, why not? It makes it sound so much more of a threat. Yeah, so there's all this like controversy now about like, we shouldn't release open models. And in fact, some of the recent executive order that was put out by the Biden-Harris administration on AI explicitly said, like, if your model is in the tens of billions of parameters, there are going to be more controls on it than there were before, right? Now, controls are going to exist now. That's the point of the executive order. And to me, that's such a step backwards. Like, the reason we have all this progress in AI today, in LLMs and other technologies, is because it's open. Our field progresses because we're so democratized and everything we do is released immediately, is replicated, is verified. Like many other fields have had replication crises. We have a small crisis, but like, we are able to replicate most things well. And if it doesn't replicate, we just say it doesn't work and we move forward. If we start closing these capabilities, like, progress will slow down drastically. And I think all of us want progress to keep being made and balance it with responsibility, but closing them isn't responsible. I think building better mechanisms and building better norms and policies for doing better evaluation and norm setting around these things is a much more productive conversation to have than to shut down open models. And what you'll see is like the other side, I actually don't think they're the other side, but the opposite side who say that open AI models are bad, aren't saying that we should stop open AI model development entirely, but they're saying that there need to be more like measures put into place. Like, all you academics need to start verifying that your models aren't being abused. Yeah. Like, we all know you don't have the time for that. Like, you're on the next thing. You're working on the next paper already. Like, I put out this LLM and like, I don't know who's using it, why they're using it, when they're using it. Neither do I have the time to build an infrastructure to like do that monitoring or even monitor the logs myself. So the net effect is, even though they make this recommendation, the net effect is just don't do OpenAI because the risk is not worth it. I think we should change that.
Also, for context, to get an idea of like what is tens of billions of parameters. I think a small like the smallest large language model, I think a lot of people think of as 7 billion, and having like 13 billion, 30 billion, I think is pretty common. Like, you can't do a ton with a 7 billion parameter model. So like the tens of billions isn't like, this is a pretty large amount of the current open source models.
Yeah. And in general, like, it's not even just about LLMs. I think the concern extends. I think the OpenAI concern is extending to things like detection models. Actually, back in 2020, one of the first things I ever did in the Bay Area The government, the Department of Commerce, had put out a draft export control mechanism where they were saying that any machine learning model that is doing detection on top of geospatial data and then also providing you a visualization of that geospatial detection is export controlled. Can't sell it without a license. And obviously, like, universities and companies like en masse wrote to the government saying this is a horrible idea. If I'm Uber and I'm showing you like the closest driver that I generated using some machine learning model and I display it on a map for you, that is export control now.
Mhm.
Right? Like, that's terrible.
Yeah.
If I'm an academic and I invented RCNN and I showed in my experiments that I could be used on geospatial data, that might be expert controlled now. So we, in the society en masse, and I was helping write CMU's response and the government's response to this as well. Like, we wrote to them, and eventually this thing was like sort of brushed to the side. But that's coming back now.
Mhm.
Like, all of that stuff is coming back. Like, any OpenAI model which could be used for something bad should be controlled. Hey, you're doing drug like pharmaceutical manufacturing, which is a great thing, by the way. Like, I want some nice cancer drugs.
Right.
Like, oh, but maybe now you shouldn't publish AlphaGo or the AlphaFold in the public anymore, or something like that, right? I think one of the reasons that it's happening is because not enough policymakers know about AI. A lot of these people writing the policies are actually not technically informed at all. They might have some training. They're smart people. And I think all of us, like AI researchers, should become a little bit more policy minded just for this conversation. If you want to preserve the way that we do research, you have to engage in this conversation.
So, the Berkeley Climate Initiative. Can you first explain what it is? I actually don't know that much about BCI. When it was made, what it is, who is in it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, great question. So the BAIR Climate Initiative is sort of a student-run initiative that aims to do better research in the fields of AI and climate. And climate is defined very broadly for us, right? It's very much anything that can be applied to the Earth in some way, shape, or form. And the whole idea is that if you ask a random person on the street today what the world's largest problem is, they would say climate change. In fact, if you ask our president what the biggest problem facing our world today is, he will also say climate change. And he's been on the record saying that climate change is the biggest issue addressing humanity. If you go talk to people at Berkeley AI Research and ask them what they're working on, it's generating higher fidelity faces.
Yeah.
And to me, that's like such a shocking like misallocation of priority and resources, right? Like, I respect my peers immensely, and I think they're the smartest minds in the world. Why aren't they working on solving the world's biggest problems rather than working on like making prettier faces? And so what the BCI is like getting people to do more research in the field of climate. But instead of doing it in a way, it's like, hey, stop building diffusion models for, celeb face generation. It's actually trying to find ways in which they can continue doing the research they're doing while still solving a problem in the world of climate almost seamlessly. And here's how we do it. Like I mentioned, like, a lot of my career has been like being inspired by problems in the world of humanitarian assistance, figuring out what the key problem is and why AI can't solve it today, building new methods to solve that problem, and then I get both an AI publication and then direct impact and transition to the field. We're doing the same thing with the BCI, right? So we'll go build the partnerships sort of around campus and around the US for like on behalf of the AI researchers. So we'll go work with the Environmental Science and Policy Management School. We'll go work with Lawrence Berkeley Lab, NASA, USGS, even NGOs like the Coral Gardeners. And they'll come to us and say, like, one of the things that really we struggle with is monitoring the health of coral reefs. Because one thing that they care about is like, so, okay, maybe this is a specific problem, right? One of the things they care about is they want to know how many fish are in the reef and how big they are. Because the bigger fish and the more fish that are in a reef, the healthier that reef is, right? It's a teeming ecosystem. The way they do this right now, like, or the way they're trying to do it, is they have put these fixed focused, fixed zoom cameras, fixed focus, fixed post cameras onto the bottom, like, of the ocean near a coral reef.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there is a big fish far away or a small fish close up, you have no way to differentiate sort of how big that fish is, right? In terms of pixels, they're exactly the same. Structure from motion doesn't work because it's fixed pose. Structure from focus and defocus doesn't work because it's a fixed focus camera. So how do we actually do depth estimation underwater to break this tie, right? So this is a huge climate problem. The climate problem is realized, right? Coral reef health estimation. The AI problem then becomes like depth estimation. How do we do depth estimation underwater? And we have to invent a whole new method that will use a whole new depth cube. So the depth cube in this case is like the further you look off into the water, the bluer and bluer things get. That is a depth cube. So can we use that depth cube as a way to do depth estimation and build a self-supervised learning method to do that? So now we've built a we're going to start doing research, AI research, that is presumably something worthy of being published at CBPR. And then as soon as that research is done, we immediately transition it to our partners in the field. And we've built these partnerships for you. And you can just go and transition it. And then all of a sudden, now you have a Nature paper that is also ready potentially because you've now changed the way that we do coral reef monitoring. Or if nothing else, you've like at least impacted the world because you can actually now monitor the coral reefs and invest resources better. And so we're working on creating data sets that instead of you doing ImageNet, use this data set instead, which has the same properties, but is climate focused. So, and has some of the cool nuances that come with it. So you can solve those problems. So we're working on sort of trying to bring climate to AI researchers rather than bringing AI researchers to the world of climate. That way you can still keep doing what you're doing and what you're really good at, but still sort of bringing all the cool innovations that we're working on into a different field entirely. And I think we've been pretty successful, like as a result of work at BCI, like we had, so in terms of success as an academic, we had one paper that was nominated for best paper at ICCV. We had another paper that won best paper at NeurIPS. I think those are successful, like things that academics would count as successful.
Yeah.
And vice versa, we've also then helped people do a better job of wildlife monitoring from satellites, and we've helped them do a better job of predicting the weather with ClimSim, right, from NeurIPS. So impact in both ways. And I want more people to sort of come to BCI and sort of engage in the work. I think that people will find that a lot of the work they do, like just on a daily basis, is almost blindly applicable to other fields, and actually will make their method a lot better if they can adapt to their considerations. But they're just not aware of it. And that's the point of BCI, is to make them more aware of those problems.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't say that I've worked too much in climate change, but I do feel like a lot of my projects, I'll present them and then people will come up and they'll give me like a real use case, often science-based or climate change based. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, it'll probably work. And then don't implement it. So should probably talk a bit more to BCI.
Yeah. I mean, the idea is like something like LADS.
Yeah.
Like you came up with that because it was a problem you were facing in your day-to-day. It's also a problem that people face with a slight twist in like the field of wildlife monitoring.
Yeah.
So that same problem could have been given to you, or like you could have been inspired by that same problem and maybe built a slightly different method that would have still been the same cool stuff that LADS has been, but also solve this other problem in the other world, right? So the whole idea is that I don't want you to move too much.
Yeah.
I don't want you to change what you're doing. But by making you aware that this other thing exists, maybe you can solve both problems in sort of one fell swoop.
Yeah.
So please do come by. We have group meetings. We try to have them every other Tuesday at 5 p.m. Over at Berkeley AI West. And if not, there's a wide variety of problem statements that we're currently fielding that we don't have the people to work on. And we'd love to get more grad students and undergrads interested in working on these problems.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So it's probably good to end soon because I need to go to the bathroom. Do you have any parting words of wisdom, things that you've learned from grad school or your time before grad school? If, say, our audience is, an undergrad looking to enter a PhD or a PhD student, or someone in machine learning who wants to do, impactful climate change research.
I wish I had wisdom. I don't think I'm there yet. But maybe I'll give something more generic, which I think has come in handy throughout my life, which is like if you really believe in something and you really want to do something, like don't take no for an answer. Like you have to keenly realize that most people who are doing day-to-day jobs really don't like their jobs and are there to say no, not because they don't believe what you're doing is right, because they don't want to do the extra work that comes with saying yes. But if you push them enough, they will eventually say yes, because they also don't want to deal with you over and over and over again. This is like keenly realized, like dealing with Pitt's bureaucracy. Like I just want to do stuff and they would say no, and then we just keep pushing. I found that to be true of everything I've done in my life so far. Just keep pushing. And so like if there's something you really believe in, find ways around whatever blocker comes up. Like there is always a way, and if that blocker is a person, there's always a way to make them believe in what you're believing. And like work on those, we call them soft skills. I believe they're actually very hard skills.
Yeah.
Like working on those soft skills, I think actually in this day and age is way more important than necessarily just getting better at writing some PyTorch code. Like there's marginal benefits for getting better at PyTorch, but there are immense benefits to like becoming 20% better at communicating your idea. So yeah, that's my advice. Like just get good at those things and never take no for an answer.
All right. Amazing.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you guys for having me. It was really fun.
Perfect.